Winter night, February 1889. Snow had been falling in Macbory since before dusk. Thick, slow flakes drifting down in a curtain that muffled the streets and made every sound seem far away. By the time the church bells tolled midnight, the town was buried in a deep hush, the kind that made even the most familiar places feel a step removed from reality. The Whitford boarding house stood on the corner of Ashwick and Bellamy, a tall, narrow building with its brick front half hidden behind a white veil of frost. Its gas lamps burned steadily in the front windows, casting warm, golden rectangles into the swirling snow, but there was no movement inside, no silhouettes passing the curtains, no shift of light from one floor to another. By early morning, the snow had piled in soft drifts along the lane, creaking faintly under the hooves of the milkman's carts. George Allerton had been delivering to the Whitford house for years, and he was used to seeing the early stirrings of its guests. A window cracked open for air, steam from a kettle trailing upward, sometimes the muffled clink of cups from the dining room. But on this morning, as his cartwheels crunched to a stop, the building looked exactly as it had the night before. The lamps were still lit, flickering faintly through the frost-patterned glass, though the sun had already begun to edge its way over the rooftops. He stood in the lane for a moment, listening. The snow seemed to swallow every sound but the faint hiss of the wind. No voices came from within. No footsteps crossed the wooden floors. Not even the low, rhythmic groan of the old radiators reached him. It was as if the entire house were holding its breath. Across the street, Mrs. Darby, who lived above the cobbler's shop, stepped out to sweep the snow from her stoop. She gave George a quick nod, then paused, her eyes following his to the Whitford house. "They're still up?" she asked, meaning the lights. When he shook his head, her brow creased. Strange. Not like Whitford to leave lamps burning after morning call. He's careful about the gas. The wind picked up, sending a fine dust of snow swirling around the milkman's boots. He shifted his crate to one arm and climbed the 2 steps to the boarding house door. The iron handle was cold enough to sting his fingers. He knocked lightly at first, then harder, the sound dull against the thick wood. No reply came from within. The silence on the other side felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were listening. He knocked once more, then leaned to the side, pressing his face toward the narrow pane of glass beside the door. Through the frost and dim interior light, he could just make out the edge of the front desk, a high-backed chair, and the open doorway leading to the hall beyond. Nothing moved. Not even a shadow flickered. The snow on the step was untouched, but for his own boots. No marks suggested an early riser stepping out for a morning errand. He told himself they must all still be asleep, and the guests worn out from travel, perhaps. Yet even as he turned to leave, the image of those still burning lamps stayed with him, glowing in the empty windows like watchful eyes. The next person to approach the house that morning was Emily Whitford, the innkeeper's niece, who made the short walk from her family's bakery with the daily bread delivery. She carried the warm loaves wrapped in a towel, the heat of them seeping through to her chilled fingers. As she neared the steps, she noticed the door was not fully closed. It sat just ajar, enough that the wind teased it back and forth on its hinges with a slow, creaking sound. Emily hesitated. The Whitford house was never left open, not in winter, not at night, and certainly not unattended. She pushed the door wider, calling out into the hall first softly, then louder. No answer came. The scent of cold air rolled out to meet her, tinged faintly with something metallic beneath the sharper notes of coal and wood smoke. From where she stood, she could see the entryway lined with guest boots and coats, each pair neatly placed, each coat hung with care. The dining room beyond was set for breakfast. Cups turned over on their saucers, sugar bowl full, teapot waiting at the center of the table. It was as if the guests had been expected to rise at any moment, and yet the rooms above, the parlor to the left, and the kitchen to the rear all lay still and silent. She stepped inside, her boots making the faintest sound on the floorboards, and the door drifted shut behind her, sealing the cold and quiet in with her. That was when she realized she could hear something, or perhaps feel it, more than hear it, a faint vibration in the air, steady and low, like a held note on an unseen instrument. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, and yet from nowhere at all. Emily set the bread down on the front desk and took a hesitant step toward the stairs, her eyes scanning the landing above. The house gave no sign of life. It stood there, in the dim glow of its own lamps, as if frozen in time. It would be hours before anyone else dared to cross its threshold, but by then the truth would be the same. The Whitford boarding house was not empty of belongings, nor of warmth only of the 11 people who had been alive and present in it the night before. When Emily finally stepped further into the Whitford boarding house, the first thing that struck her was how nothing looked disturbed, and yet everything felt wrong. The air was warmer than outside, heavy with the lingering scent of coal fires that had burned down to embers during the night. A faint trace of breakfast preparations clung to the kitchen doorway coffee grounds, a hint of frying butter, but the stove sat cold, its iron plates dusted lightly with ash. She moved toward the dining room and found the table still neatly arranged, chairs pushed in, place settings undisturbed as though the guests had intended to come down together at the same moment, only to be halted by something unseen. Upstairs, the guest rooms told a stranger story still. The first door she opened revealed a bed with the covers rumpled, sheets holding the deep impression of a sleeper's body. Beside it, a pair of well-worn boots stood neatly together on a small rug. The guest's coat still hung from the peg by the door, and on the nightstand lay a pocket watch, its chain coiled in a perfect spiral. The watch was still ticking. The next room was much the same. A nightdress draped over the back of a chair, an open book face down on the quilt, as though the reader had meant to return after a moment. In the third room, a gentleman's suitcase sat open at the foot of the bed, shirts folded with precise care, a shaving kit resting on top. The water in the basin was cold now, but the thin film of soap bubbles clinging to the edge suggested it had been used only hours earlier. In every room there were signs of life, half-written letters on desks, gloves laid out on chairs, personal effects left as though the owners were merely in the next room. But there was no one. Not a sound of footsteps, no creak of the floorboards, no muffled voices behind closed doors. The house seemed to have swallowed its occupants whole, leaving behind only the residue of their presence. When Constable Milne arrived later that morning, summoned by a pale and shaken Emily, he moved methodically through the boarding house. He counted 11 rooms occupied by guests, 11 beds slept in, 11 sets of personal belongings intact. Even the register on the front desk bore their names and signatures from the night before, each written in different hand, some in careful cursive, others in quick, jagged strokes. The ink was not yet faded. Milne questioned the neighbors. Mrs. Darby, across the street, insisted she had seen movement in the upper windows around 11:30, a dim shape crossing the curtain, pausing for a moment, as though listening to something outside. She also claimed to have heard music, faint but distinct, drifting from the direction of the boarding house, a slow, deliberate piano melody. The Whitford house had no piano. A passing lamplighter told a different story. Just before midnight, while making his final rounds, he glanced up at the windows and seen not one or two, but several figures standing perfectly still, side by side, as if looking out over the street. They didn't move, he said, and there were no lamps lit behind them, just the glow from the gas on the street catching their faces, or what I thought were faces. The last confirmed interaction with the missing guests came from Mrs. Whitford herself, the innkeeper's widow, who had served them supper in the dining room. She remembered each of them, the middle-aged couple traveling south from Ashfield, the young schoolteacher with a satchel full of exercise books, a traveling salesman with his battered leather case, 2 farmhands, a watchmaker from the coast, and a family of 3 bound for the railway the next morning. All had eaten well, spoken politely, and retired to their rooms just before the snow began to fall in earnest. Nothing in their manner suggested unease. By morning it was as though they had risen together, left their rooms without their coats or shoes, and simply vanished. Not a single boot print marked the snow outside the boarding house, and no tracks led to the street, the alley, or the garden behind. 11 people had gone to bed under the same roof in the same building, and not one had been seen leaving through any door or window. Constable Milne began his formal investigation before the day was out, moving from room to room, questioning every possible witness and making notes in his small, leather-bound notebook. On paper, the facts were straightforward. 11 guests checked into the Whitford boarding house on the night of February 11th, 1889. 11 guests were seen alive at supper. By morning, all were gone, leaving behind every personal belonging they had brought into the house. There were no signs of forced entry or exit, no footprints in the snow, and no credible explanation. But as the hours passed, the story became tangled with small, unsettling details. The milkman confirmed his early morning visit lamps burning, door closed, house silent. Emily Whitford recounted the moment she arrived, finding the door ajar and no one answering her calls. The neighbors' statements added texture but no clarity. Mrs. Darby's claim of hearing piano music around midnight became a point of contention. The boarding house contained no piano, and she was certain the melody was slow, almost ceremonial, unlike anything she had heard before. Her sighting of a shadow in the window was dismissed by some as a trick of the lamplight against the snow. Then came the lamplighter's account. He insisted he had seen multiple figures in the windows shortly after 11, lined up in a strange formation, not milling about as guests might, but standing perfectly still, their faces turned toward the street. The image unsettled Milne enough to note it twice in his record. When asked if he recognized any of them, the lamplighter said no, but added that, oddly, the shapes seemed taller than the guests he had glimpsed earlier that day, as if they were standing on something, or as if they were not quite shaped like people should be. Inside, the investigation took a more methodical turn. Milne examined the locks on every door and window. All were intact, with no scratches or damage suggesting tampering. The snow on the window ledges was undisturbed, as was the drift piled outside the rear kitchen door. The cellar door, however, was locked from the inside. When forced open, it revealed nothing more than damp stone walls, shelves stacked with preserved goods, and a thin patch of frost on the floor, an oddity in an otherwise insulated space. The frost shape was stranger still, a cluster of bare footprints, small and irregular, ending abruptly in the center of the room. The boarding house's guest ledger might have provided answers, but when Milne asked to review the entries from earlier that week, Mrs. Whitford discovered several pages missing. The tear was clean, deliberate, as though the sheets had been carefully removed with a blade. She swore she had last seen the book intact the night before, when she entered the names of her final guests. The ink from those entries was still faintly smudged where it had not yet fully dried. No valuables were taken. Watches lay on bedside tables, purses remained on desks, and even the traveling salesman's locked case was untouched. The absence of theft ruled out ordinary burglary, but the absence of any human trace made other explanations feel equally improbable. Milne's questions to the surrounding shops and taverns yielded no new sightings. No strangers had been reported in the streets that night, no carriages had left town during the storm, and the station master confirmed that no trains had departed before dawn. In theory, the guests could not have left Macbory at all, and yet they were not in Macbory anymore. By late afternoon, the constable's notebook was full of disconnected fragments. An open door, a missing ledger, music no one could account for, unmoving figures in the window, and frost footprints in a locked cellar. When he tried to string them together into something coherent, the shape of the story refused to settle. That evening, as he stepped out into the snow, Milne glanced back at the boarding house. The lamp still burned behind its windows, casting the same warm glow that had greeted the milkman at dawn. Inside, 11 sets of belongings waited patiently for owners who had not returned and, in all likelihood, never would. By the following morning, Constable Milne had requested a more thorough search of the Whitford boarding house. 2 additional officers from the district arrived, their boots crunching through the snow as they carried lanterns and canvas sacks for collecting evidence. The building was examined from cellar to attic with a precision that bordered on desperation. Every drawer was open, every cupboard emptied, every loose floorboard tapped. Yet for all the movement and noise the search brought into the house, the air inside remained unnervingly still, as if the place itself were holding back something it did not wish to yield. The locked cellar, already forced open the previous day, drew particular attention. The frost footprints were still there, unaltered by the warmth of the men's lanterns. They were small, too small for any of the missing guests, and their shape was wrong, the toes tapering to odd points, rather than ending in the blunt curve of a human foot. The prints began near the wall beneath the narrow window and ended abruptly in the center of the room, with no sign of turning back. One of the district officers crouched to examine them more closely and remarked, almost to himself, that they looked as if something had stepped in from nowhere and then stepped out again. The kitchen, too, presented an anomaly. On the back wall, behind a stack of crates, a section of wallpaper had peeled away, revealing what appeared to be a small, bricked-up doorway. The bricks were old, their mortar crumbling at the edges, but there was no record in the house's plans of a door ever existing there. Mrs. Whitford claimed she had never seen it uncovered in all her years managing the place. When asked if it should be opened, she hesitated, then shook her head, muttering that some things ought to remain shut. In the dining room, the table was cleared for inspection. Every chair bore faint indentations on the seat cushions, as if the guests had only just risen from them. On the mantel above the hearth, a row of porcelain figurines had been rearranged into a line that neither Mrs. Whitford nor Emily recognized. The smallest figure, a woman in a long dress, had been turned to face the wall. The upstairs rooms gave up one last piece of strangeness. In the chamber where the watchmaker had stayed, the officers found the curtains drawn tight, though every other room's windows had been left partly open for air. When Milne pulled the fabric aside, he found the glass faintly frosted from the inside, the frost forming delicate, spiraling lines that almost resembled handwriting. He leaned closer, trying to make out shapes, but before he could study them further, the warmth from his lantern made the patterns vanish. Back on the ground floor, the missing ledger pages remained a sticking point. Without them, the investigation could not even confirm the full number of nights each guest had been staying. Mrs. Whitford repeated her insistence that she had not removed them, and Emily vouched for her honesty. Yet the torn edges showed no signs of accident. They had been removed with precision, as though by someone with both time and purpose. By afternoon, the officers had carried away several items for examination. The watch from the first room, the porcelain figure from the mantel, and a scrap of the wallpaper from the bricked-up kitchen doorway. None of these objects would later be found in the official case inventory, and no one could say what had become of them. Before leaving, Milne took one last walk through the house alone. In the front hall, he paused by the row of guest coats, each still hanging exactly where it had been left. He reached out to touch the sleeve of the schoolteacher's overcoat, and was startled to find it faintly damp, as if it had been worn outside recently. Yet the snow on the front steps was untouched since the storm. When he finally stepped back into the street, the wind had risen, rattling the house's shutters in slow, uneven beats. Behind the windows, the lamps still burned, stubbornly casting their light into the snow as if trying to pretend that nothing inside had changed. The investigation might have been contained to whispers in Macbory had it not been for the strange occurrences that began in the days following the search. Locals passing the Whitford boarding house after dark reported hearing faint knocks from inside, rhythmic and deliberate, always in groups of 3. Others swore they saw movement behind the curtains in the upstairs rooms, not the vague shifting of fabric in a draft, but the clear outline of figures pausing, turning, and then disappearing into the shadows. Constable Milne returned twice more, both times accompanied by an officer, but on each occasion, the interior was as silent and still as when he had first found it. The frost footprints in the cellar had melted by then, but the floor bore faint damp marks where they had been, as though the stone retained the memory of their presence. The bricked-up kitchen doorway remained undisturbed, though Emily admitted she had heard a low sound from that part of the house at night, something between a hum and a whisper. She refused to elaborate, and Milne, perhaps wisely, did not press her. The missing guest's belongings were another matter. A week after the disappearances, the schoolteacher's satchel was found on the front steps one morning, his leather strap broken cleanly in half. Inside, the exercise books were still neatly stacked, but every page was blank, the ink having faded as though it had never been there at all. 2 days later, a pair of boots belonging to the traveling salesman appeared in the alley behind the boarding house, both laces tied into perfect, elaborate knots that neither Milne nor his men could undo. Rumors thickened. Some claimed the house was cursed, that it had been built on ground once used for unholy rituals, though no parish records confirmed this. Others whispered about the missing ledger pages, suggesting they had been taken to conceal the identities of the guests not from the law, but from something else entirely. The story of the bricked-up door spread quickly, and more than one curious youth was caught trying to sneak inside at night to see it for themselves. There were stranger reports still. One evening, a stable hand claimed to have seen a faint glow moving along the upstairs hallway through the windows like a lantern carried by an unseen hand. Another said they had heard faint strains of music, the same slow piano misses Darby had mentioned floating from the house in the early hours before dawn. The nearest home with a piano was 3 streets away. Despite the unease, Milne remained focused on his task. He had sent word to surrounding towns and cities with descriptions of the 11 missing guests, but no matches came back. No bodies were found in the fields or woods beyond Macbory, and no personal effects were discovered on the roads leading out of town. It was as if the missing had not merely left the boarding house, but had been erased from the landscape entirely. The case was beginning to slip from the realm of standard police work into something less tangible. The locals avoided the Whitford boarding house at night now, crossing the street rather than walking directly past it. Some swore the shadows in its windows moved when there was no one inside. Mrs. Whitford, still shaken, had moved in with a cousin in the next village, leaving the place locked and unlit, though the lamplighter continued to insist that certain windows glowed faintly on some nights, regardless. Milne recorded each of these developments in his notebook with careful, almost reluctant handwriting. But as winter dragged on, the list of unanswered questions grew longer than the list of certainties. And in the heart of Macbory, the silent boarding house stood untouched, its doors closed, yet never quite empty. Weeks turned into months, and the Whitford boarding house began to take on the stillness of a place left outside of time. The snow that had once cloaked its roof melted and froze again in uneven layers, leaving the shingles slick with ice. Weeds began to push through the frost near the foundation, their stubborn growth a strange defiance against the season. The front steps gathered wind-blown debris, bits of paper, broken twigs, a child's lost mitten, as if the house were quietly collecting the world's forgotten things. The townspeople no longer debated whether the disappearances had been solved. They knew they hadn't. What they argued over now was whether the building was safe to even look at for too long. Some insisted that staring into the upstairs windows for more than a few seconds could leave you feeling as though someone was staring back. Others claimed that on certain nights the front door appeared slightly open, only to be found locked tight by morning. A few even said they had glimpsed faces in the glass, pale, expressionless, and unfamiliar, but never for long enough to describe them in detail. Children turned the story into a dare. They would creep up to the warped front door, place one hand on the cold wood, and whisper, "They never left. They just stopped being seen." It was said that if you spoke the line aloud, the air around you would shift, becoming heavier, as though the house was listening. On more than one occasion, a daring child would return home pale and shaky, unable to explain what they had heard or thought they had heard while standing there. Constable Milne eventually closed the case in name only, listing the guests as missing, presumed dead. But in his private notebook he added a final line. If they are dead, the house is not. He knew there was no evidence strong enough to justify tearing the building down, and perhaps no authority in Macbory willing to carry out such a task. Instead, the Whitford boarding house was left to itself, its shutters rattling in the wind, its chimney silent, its windows reflecting nothing that belonged to the street outside. As the years passed, the property's ownership records became muddled. Letters from prospective buyers went unanswered. Surveyors who came to assess the house never stayed the night, and rarely spoke of their work afterward. The town council eventually stopped mentioning it in official meetings altogether, as though pretending it was no longer part of Macbory would make it so. Yet the house remained, and every so often, in the dead of winter, a traveler passing through would stop in the street and stare at the lamplight burning faintly in an upstairs room, swaying as if carried by an unseen hand. They might ask at the tavern who lived there, and the barman would simply shake his head and say, "No one?" But in Macbory, no one didn't always mean empty. Sometimes it meant exactly the opposite.